Hi, I'm Professor John W.I. Lee. I'm a professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Barbara.
And teach history.
History is the study of the past. Most people know that, but it's also the study of processes and developments and institutions and experiences of the past, not just of names, dates, and places. In one sentence, history is the discipline you need to know if you want to know about the past, understand the present, and plan for the future. For me as a history professor, one of the most exciting things is the freedom to study and research and teach about pretty much whatever I like. My main field is ancient Greece and ancient Persia or Iran, but in recent years I've been doing a lot of work in African American history and the intellectual history of the 19th century United States. So being a historian really allows me to look at different places, times, and people, and to try to ask questions about how things happen and why they happen, and to look for evidence that will find answers to those questions. What's exciting and fascinates me about what I study and what I teach? For the ancient world, I think I started out being interested in it because it was so far away from what I knew. I grew up in Hawaii, where we took Asian history and Indian history and, of course, Hawaiian history, but I'd never heard about ancient Greece. And so when I came to college, I took basically an introductory history class where I learned about Greece and Rome and other ancient societies. So to me, what's fascinating about this material is that it's foreign and different and strange, and I had never heard about it until I took a history survey class. Then once I became a graduate student and now a professor, what's fascinating about history is it's almost like a detective story. You need to get lots of little pieces of evidence which don't tell the whole story. Some of them are contradictory, and you have to put them together to try to figure out what might really have been going on. How did I get involved in history? Well, as I mentioned, I didn't go to college planning to study ancient history. In fact, my father was a diplomat for the U.S. Foreign Service, and I wanted to be a diplomat. I wanted to be just like my dad, and I wanted to study modern history. So I knew history interested me, but it was really just an accident that I had a really good teacher who taught me about ancient Greece and Rome, and I went on from there. It wasn't something I planned. Something else that in my road to being a historian was important was studying languages. So in studying ancient history, you have to know Greek and Latin, French and German, and several other languages, ideally. So I happened to have a knack for languages. Someone said, you should take Latin, and then you should take Greek, and I was on the road from there. The methods that we use as historians can vary dramatically from scholar to scholar and from field to field. So in ancient history, we have a wide variety. First of all, we read ancient texts that have been passed down to us through manuscripts or have been transmitted through manuscripts or are found in excavations, papyrus scraps, for example. So texts are the first thing that we look at, and our method is really to read those texts very, very carefully. We look for choice of language and people's names, repeated patterns, the way stories are told. Sometimes our texts are broken into pieces, so we actually have to reassemble them and put them back together. So for an ancient historian, looking at text is the first thing. And that's probably what we have in common with everyone else who does history, that reading textual material, whether it's archival documents or people's memoirs or published sources, that's what all historians would say is our common methodology. But in some fields or some parts of history, like ancient history, we use other methods. For example, I've worked on archaeological excavations. So an ancient historian has to know how to deal with things like pottery. What do potsherds tell you about trade, or about cultural exchange, or about the ways that folks were drinking and eating in an ancient time? that kind of stuff often isn't described in our written sources. So we have to look at archaeological material as well. And it might be pottery, it might be sculpture, it might be ancient buildings. I do a lot of work with ancient warfare, so weaponry, armor, fortifications, those kinds of things are also involved. And then historians of many periods use different models or approaches to organize or think about the knowledge that they're looking at. And they might use models drawn from political science or literature or sociology or anthropology. So these are ways where historians kind of borrow or interact with the methodologies of other fields. And to go back to your earlier question about what's fascinating, a historian is kind of the universal investigator, right? Our job is to look at human societies, and in that search, we draw in the methods of many different fields. One last thing, I mentioned my more recent research, which is on 19th century history and African American intellectual history. Well, thanks to things like Google Books and HathiTrust and Internet Archive, there are many, many sources for this period which are available online, and they're searchable. So if you're looking for the lives of African American scholars in the 19th century and you're trying to trace their intellectual networks, these new technologies make it possible to find out stories that otherwise would be lost, because having to do that 10 or 20 years ago would mean you'd sit there with thousands of pages of paper, paging through it, and you might miss it. Now, with the aid of this kind of digitized sources, at least for me, it opens up a whole new world where you can find little bits and pieces you otherwise would never know about. There are many different ways for students who are interested in history to get involved in research, even without being a history major. There are various programs at UCSB where you can be a research assistant. I have, for example, had geography students help me to construct maps and online atlases of the ancient world. Students who are really more interested in research can do independent research projects with history professors. So, for example, I have a student right now who's working in UCSB Special Collections, and she's looking at a set of maps from the First World War and trying to understand their historical significance. And that same student, actually 2 years ago now, when she was a freshman, worked with me on an exhibition at the UCSB library where we had an exhibition of First World War helmets. And we talked about changes in technology and culture during 1914 to 1918. And that student actually began as an economics major, but she switched her major to history because she realized she really liked this way of investigating the past. About history in general, the thing they find hardest is careful reading. And in today's society, things that are slow and difficult and take a long time can be challenging, right? We want the quick answer. We want the 50-word or however many words are in a tweet. We want the short answer. And history is challenging because you have to read a lot, and the reading is not always the easiest. Reading an ancient king's inscription, for example, from 500 BC, is not like reading the newspaper today or reading a novel. You have to look carefully, as I mentioned, at the language, at the way it's presented, and so on. I think that's one thing students find challenging about history. Then in some fields, U.S. history, the names and places are familiar, but in other fields, such as ancient history, even pronouncing a name or figuring out where that place is on a map can be a challenge. And I think at first, students find that tough. What keeps me being a professor is, first of all, my love of doing what I do. This is a job that it's demanding. You work all the time. There's no set work hours. It's a really challenging job in that respect. You have to balance teaching and research, especially at a research university such as UC Santa Barbara. The demands of these are both very high. But I have to say I love it. I mean, this is the job that I've trained for. I've been working at for many years. It lets me pursue the things that interest me and hopefully even make a difference in students' lives. the best way to be prepared for the first day of any history class is to have read the syllabus, so the material that's assigned for the quarter, to have made a plan for how you're going to go through the quarter, and to have a commitment to doing the reading, being present, and taking part. Going to a history lecture is a tough job for a student. You know, you sit there and someone is going to speak for 45 minutes or an hour. Again, we're not trained to do that in today's society, right? We want the quick answer. And so as a student, being prepared and committed to pay close attention and learning how to do that, I think, is one way to be ready. Another thing that's helpful for a student is not to think that history is just names and dates. And unfortunately, too many times students come thinking that because maybe in high school or elsewhere, that's what their teacher told them. But we really try to emphasize that history is about interpreting and analyzing the past, that it's not a single fixed story all through time, but it's really about how people have read or considered or analyzed that past and have offered different viewpoints over time. So a student who's ready to do that, to accept that there's not one fixed truth, but that history consists of carefully evaluating evidence and carefully making rational and logical arguments, then the student will be ready to succeed. So one of the great things about the history department at UC Santa Barbara is that it covers everything from ancient Egypt and ancient China and ancient Greece all the way up to the space age, the history of digital technologies, the history of astronomy, and even the history of big data. History at UC Santa Barbara covers every place from Africa to East Asia to South Asia to Europe and the Americas. And you can study history from such a wide variety of perspectives, whether it's economics and politics, society and culture, gender, warfare, ideas about art and literature. There are so many different approaches you'll find in a history department. For me, at least, history is kind of the place that brings together many different aspects of the humanities. Before there were other humanities departments, there was history, and we continue to value and maintain those connections. So if you want to study the past but also want to study the present, history is a great place to be doing that.